The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform one last time. At 23, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in regulation style. What made heads turn wasn't her petite frame or quiet demeanor, but the distinctive scar that ran from her left temple down to her jawline, a jagged white line that caught the light whenever she moved. The other recruits had noticed it immediately when she arrived at Fort Braxton 3 weeks ago. During mess hall conversations, she caught them stealing glances and whispering among themselves. Some were curious, others seemed uncomfortable, but a particular group led by Marcus Webb found it amusing. Webb was everything Sarah wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, and loud. He came from a military family and never let anyone forget it. His father had been a decorated sergeant, his grandfather a war hero. Webb carried himself like he owned the place, and in many ways, he did. Other recruits naturally gravitated toward him, seeking his approval and fearing his ridicule. "Hey, Scarface, you missed a spot shining your boots," Webb called out during morning inspection, causing several recruits to snicker. Sarah kept her eyes forward, jaw clenched, as Drill Sergeant Peterson walked past without acknowledging the comment. The harassment had started small, whispered comments about her appearance, jokes about how she probably got the scar in a kitchen accident or falling off her bike. Webb seemed to take particular pleasure in these moments, his voice carrying just loud enough for others to hear but quiet enough to avoid official notice. During physical training, Webb would make exaggerated gestures of concern. "Careful there, Scarface. Don't want to add any more decorations to that face of yours," he'd say while they crawled under barbed wire or climbed rope walls. His cronies Johnson, Miller, and Rodriguez always laughed on cue, encouraging his behavior. Sarah had faced this kind of treatment before. Growing up in a small Texas town, she'd endured years of stares and comments from classmates who didn't understand. But she'd learned early that responding with anger or tears only made things worse. Instead, she focused on proving herself through actions rather than words. She excelled in every aspect of training. Her marksmanship scores were consistently in the top 5%. During obstacle courses, she might be smaller than the others, but she was faster and more agile. When they studied military history and tactics, she asked intelligent questions and provided thoughtful answers that impressed their instructors, but Webb's group seemed determined to undermine her confidence at every opportunity. During a particularly grueling endurance run, Webb jogged alongside her, making cutting remarks about how the scar probably threw off her balance. When they practiced combat drills, he'd make theatrical gestures of protecting his own face, claiming he didn't want to end up looking like Halloween. The other recruits were divided in their reactions. Some, like quiet Jennifer Chen and serious-minded David Park, seemed uncomfortable with Webb's behavior, but didn't speak up. Others appeared to enjoy the entertainment, grateful that someone else was bearing the brunt of Webb's attention. A few seemed genuinely curious about Sarah's story, but were too intimidated by Webb's group to approach her directly. 3 weeks into training, the dynamic reached a breaking point during a particularly intense day of combat exercises. The recruits were practicing close-quarters combat techniques, working in pairs to master defensive and offensive maneuvers. Sweat dripped from their faces as they grappled and struck at padded targets under the scorching afternoon sun. Sarah had been paired with Miller, one of Webb's followers. As they worked through the prescribed movements, Miller kept making remarks about being careful not to damage her good side. Other recruits began to gather around, sensing that something was building to a climax. "Maybe you should consider a different career path," Webb called out from across the training mat. "Something where appearance doesn't matter, like working in a morgue." The comment drew nervous laughter from several onlookers. Sarah finished her drill sequence with Miller and turned to face Webb directly for the first time since training began. Her dark eyes held a steady, unflinching gaze that made him slightly uncomfortable, though he masked it with an even broader grin. "You got something to say, Scarface?" Webb challenged, puffing out his chest and taking a step closer. The training ground had grown notably quieter, with even the drill sergeants pausing their activities to observe what was unfolding. Before Sarah could respond, a sharp whistle blast echoed across the compound. "Fall in! Now!" Drill Sergeant Peterson's voice boomed across the training area. The moment was broken as recruits scrambled to form proper formation, but the tension remained thick in the air. As they stood at attention, Sarah could feel Webb's eyes boring into the back of her head. She knew this confrontation was far from over. The harassment had been escalating for weeks, and she sensed that something would have to give soon. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching these interactions very carefully, someone whose opinion would matter more than any recruit's cruel joke. Colonel James Harrison had been observing the new training class from his office window, which overlooked the main drill areas. At 52, he was a man who had seen enough of war and human nature to recognize both strength and weakness when he saw them. What he'd witnessed over the past few weeks had troubled him deeply, not because of the harassment itself. Military training was designed to test people under pressure, but because of what it revealed about the character of those involved. That evening, as the recruits settled into their barracks for another night of exhausted sleep, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. The scar on her face felt tight, as it always did when she was stressed. She touched it gently with her fingertips, remembering the day it had changed her life forever. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more tests, and likely more harassment from Webb's group. But Sarah Martinez had survived worse than cruel jokes and intimidation. The story behind her scar was one of courage, sacrifice, and split-second decisions that had saved lives. Soon, whether she wanted it or not, that story would come to light in a way that would change everything for every recruit in their training class. The next morning brought an unexpected announcement. Instead of their usual training routine, the recruits were ordered to report to the main briefing hall after breakfast. The large room, typically used for orientation sessions and formal presentations, buzzed with nervous energy as 52 young men and women filed in and took their seats. Colonel Harrison entered through a side door, his posture commanding immediate silence. Behind him walked a woman in civilian clothes, someone Sarah recognized but hoped the others wouldn't. The woman was Dr. Saigaga, Emily Foster, a trauma surgeon from Houston General Hospital, and her presence here meant only one thing: recruits. Today we're going to discuss something that goes beyond physical training and military protocol. Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying easily through the room without amplification. We're going to talk about character, about judgment, and about the values that separate true soldiers from people who simply wear the uniform. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the front. Something about the colonel's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a routine lecture about military history or equipment maintenance. Dr. Foster has joined us today to share a story. It's a true story about courage under pressure, about making impossible decisions in life or death situations, and about the marks that real heroism can leave on a person. The colonel's eyes swept across the room, lingering for just a moment on Webb's group before settling on Sarah, who had gone very pale. Dr. Foster stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an emotional weight that immediately captured everyone's attention. 2 years ago, I was working a late shift in our emergency department when the unthinkable happened. A natural gas explosion at an apartment complex across the city sent dozens of victims to our hospital in a matter of minutes. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle over the room. Among the victims were 3 children, ages 6, with 8 and 10 who were trapped on the second floor of their building when the explosion occurred. The stairwell had collapsed, the elevator was destroyed, and smoke was filling the building rapidly. Sarah's hands gripped the edges of her chair, her knuckles white. She hoped this day would never come, that her past could remain private. But as Dr. Foster continued, she realized there was no escape from the story that had defined her life. Sarah Martinez was working as a volunteer firefighter that evening, Dr. Foster said, and every head in the room turned to stare at the small woman who had been the target of so much ridicule. She wasn't even supposed to be on duty, but when the call came in, she grabbed her gear and responded anyway. Webb's mouth fell open slightly. The woman he'd been calling Scarface for weeks had been a firefighter? The same woman he'd mocked for her size and appearance had run toward danger while others ran away. The fire chief ordered everyone out of the building. Dr. Foster continued. The structure was compromised, the smoke was too thick, and conventional rescue methods weren't working. But Sarah could hear those children screaming from the second floor. She made a decision that went against direct orders, against protocol, and against her own safety. The room was completely silent now. Even the drill sergeants who had been standing at the back of the room were leaning forward, captivated by the story. She climbed up the outside of the building using a damaged fire escape that engineers later said shouldn't have supported half her weight. She broke through a window with her bare hands, cutting herself severely in the process. Dr. Foster gestured towards Sarah's face. That's where her scar came from. Not from an accident or a fall, but from saving the lives of 3 children. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the heat, the smoke, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she made trip after trip through that window. She remembered the weight of 6-year-old Emma in her arms, the way 8-year-old Marcus had clung to her neck, the determination in 10-year-old Sophie's eyes as Sarah taught her to rappel down the fire escape using a makeshift rope system. She brought out all 3 children, one at a time, Dr. Foster continued. By the 3rd trip, she was operating in near-zero visibility, with smoke inhalation that should have incapacitated her, and with blood from her facial injury making it even harder to see. But she didn't stop until every child was safe. Webb felt sick to his stomach. Every joke he'd made, every cruel comment about her appearance, every moment he'd treated her as less than worthy, all of it played back in his mind with horrifying clarity. Around him, other recruits were having similar realizations. The fire chief later said it was the most courageous act he'd witnessed in 25 years of service, Dr. Foster added. Sarah spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from smoke inhalation and the facial injuries. She could have had plastic surgery to minimize the scarring, but she chose not to. When I asked her why, she said the scar reminded her that she had chosen to act when action was needed. Colonel Harrison stepped forward again. Sarah never mentioned any of this during her application process or in interviews. We only learned about it when Dr. Foster contacted us to provide a character reference. Sarah had listed her as a reference, not knowing that Dr. Foster would share the full story. Sarah's face was burning with embarrassment and something approaching anger. She had worked so hard to leave that night behind her, to move forward without having her entire identity defined by one traumatic event. The last thing she wanted was for her military service to be overshadowed by civilian heroics. The reason I'm sharing this story, Colonel Harrison continued, is not to embarrass recruit Martinez or to put her on a pedestal. It's because over the past 3 weeks I've observed behavior in this training class that deeply concerns me. His voice grew harder, more commanding. I've watched some of you make assumptions about your fellow recruits based on their appearance. I've seen mockery, harassment, and the kind of shallow thinking that has no place in the United States military. Webb's face had gone from red to pale to green. He couldn't bring himself to look at Sarah, couldn't face the magnitude of his own misjudgment and cruelty. The military doesn't need soldiers who can only show courage when they're surrounded by people who look like them, think like them, or fit their narrow definition of what a hero should look like, Colonel Harrison said. We need people who understand that true strength often comes in unexpected packages, that real courage sometimes leaves marks, and that character is revealed not in our best moments, but in how we treat others during theirs. Dr. Foster added one final detail that hit the room like a thunderclap. Those 3 children Sarah saved, they're thriving today. Emma just started 2nd grade and wants to be a firefighter when she grows up. Marcus is playing Little League baseball and has never missed a game. Sophie is taking piano lessons and sends Sarah a Christmas card every year with a drawing of the 2 of them together. The silence that followed was deafening. Some recruits were openly crying. Others stared at their hands, ashamed of their own behavior and assumptions. Webb felt like he might be physically sick, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. Training will continue as normal tomorrow, Colonel Harrison announced. But I want you all to spend tonight thinking about what kind of soldier, what kind of person you want to be. Because I can teach you to shoot, to march, to follow orders, and to use military equipment. But I cannot teach you character. That's something you have to choose for yourself. As the recruits were dismissed, Sarah remained seated while the room emptied around her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and angry that her private trauma had been turned into a public lesson. But she also felt something else, a sense that perhaps, finally, the harassment would end. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was noticeable from the very next morning. Webb arrived at breakfast early, something he never did, and when Sarah entered the mess hall, he stood up and walked directly toward her table. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." Sarah looked up from her tray, her expression guarded but not hostile. "What about?" Webb glanced around the room, aware that dozens of eyes were watching this interaction. Can we talk outside?" They walked out to a small courtyard behind the mess hall, away from the curious stares of their fellow recruits. Webb seemed to struggle with his words, starting and stopping several times before finally finding his voice. "I don't know how to apologize for what I've done," he said, his usual confidence completely absent. "I've been thinking all night, and I keep coming back to the same thought. I'm not worthy to shine your boots, let alone share the same uniform." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like self-loathing. I called you names, Webb continued, his voice breaking slightly. I made fun of something that came from you saving children's lives. I don't know how to live with that. I don't know how you can even look at me. Webb, Sarah said quietly, I'm not asking you to live with anything. What I want is for it to stop. All of it. The comments, the looks, the jokes. I want to be judged on my performance here, not on my appearance or my past. It will stop, Webb said immediately. I'll make sure of it. And if anyone else says anything, they'll answer to me. Sarah shook her head. That's not what I want either. I don't need you to fight my battles. I just need to be treated like any other recruit. Webb nodded, though he looked confused. But how can I just go back to treating you normally after learning what I learned? You're a hero. You saved 3 kids. You risked your life when no one else would. That's exactly the problem, Sarah said, a flash of frustration crossing her face. Yesterday you saw me as less than human because of my scar. Now you want to see me as more than human because of what caused it. Both reactions are wrong. She stood up, preparing to head back inside for the start of the training day. I'm not a hero, Webb. I'm not a villain. I'm not a victim. I'm just a recruit, same as you, trying to make it through training and become a soldier. That's all I've ever wanted to be treated as. Their conversation set the tone for what followed. Over the next several days, the dynamic in their training class shifted dramatically. The crude jokes and harassment stopped completely, but something else stopped too. The natural camaraderie and easy interactions that Sarah had hoped for. Instead, she found herself isolated in a different way. Where before she had been ignored or mocked, now she was treated with an awkward reverence that felt almost as uncomfortable. Recruits would fall silent when she entered a room, step aside to let her pass first, and speak to her with a formal politeness that felt artificial and exhausting. During training exercises, partners would defer to her judgment even when they disagreed. In study groups, other recruits would automatically assume she should take the lead. When drill sergeants asked questions, eyes would turn to her expectantly, as if her civilian heroics had somehow made her an expert on military matters. Jennifer Chen was the first to recognize what was happening. She approached Sarah during a break in weapons training, sitting down beside her on a bench outside the armory. This isn't what you wanted, is it? Jennifer asked without preamble. Sarah looked at her in surprise. Jennifer had barely spoken to anyone since training began, preferring to keep to herself and focus on her studies. What do you mean? The way everyone's treating you now? Like you're made of glass or gold or something. It's just a different kind of wrong, isn't it? Sarah felt a wave of relief that someone finally understood. Exactly! I went from being Scarface to being the hero who saved 3 children, but I'm still not just Sarah Martinez recruit. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. My older brother went through something similar. He pulled a family out of a car accident when he was in high school. For the rest of his senior year, everyone treated him like he was different. He said it was almost worse than being ignored. What did he do about it? He waited, Jennifer said simply. He kept being himself, kept doing his job, kept treating others normally even when they didn't return the favor. Eventually, people got tired of walking on eggshells around him, but it took time. That evening, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. During the informal gathering that recruits had each night in the common area of their barracks, she stood up and addressed the room. I want to say something to all of you, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the space. The room fell silent immediately, confirming her suspicions about how differently she was being treated. 2 days ago, Colonel Harrison shared a story about something that happened to me before I enlisted. I didn't want that story shared, and I'm not comfortable with how some of you have been treating me since then. She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. I understand that you're trying to show respect, but what I need from you is normalcy. I need you to disagree with me when you think I'm wrong. I need you to compete with me during training. I need you to treat me like what I am, another recruit trying to make it through this program. Webb, who had been sitting near the back, raised his hand tentatively. But how do we just forget what we learned? How do we pretend we don't know what you did? You don't forget, Sarah said, but you also don't let it define every interaction we have. That night in Houston was one night of my life. It was important, yes, but it doesn't make me better or worse than any of you. It just makes me someone who was in the right place at the right time and made a choice. David Park, who had been silent throughout most of their training, spoke up from his corner. What if we had made a different choice? What if we had been too scared? Then you would have made a different choice, Sarah said simply. And maybe someone else would have acted. Or maybe those children would have died, and I would have had to live with not trying. The point is, none of us know how we'll react in a crisis until we're in one. Miller, one of Webb's former followers, looked uncomfortable as he asked, "So what do you want from us? How should we act?" Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "Ask me about my hometown. Complain when I beat your scores on the obstacle course. Tell me when you think I'm wrong about something. Invite me to join your card game, or don't invite me because you don't like the way I play. Treat me like you would treat anyone else you're getting to know." The conversation that followed was tentative but real. Recruits began asking Sarah normal questions: where she grew up, what she studied in college, whether she had siblings. She answered honestly, sharing stories about her childhood in Texas, her struggles in community college, her decision to join the military. Gradually, over the following weeks, the artificial reverence faded. It was replaced by something much more valuable: genuine relationships based on shared experiences and mutual respect. Sarah found herself becoming friends with Jennifer, whose quiet intelligence she admired. She developed a friendly rivalry with David Park, who pushed her to improve during physical training. Even Webb, after weeks of awkward interactions, eventually relaxed enough to joke with her about their respective weaknesses in tactical studies. The real test came during their final training exercise, a complex multi-day simulation that would determine their readiness for advanced military training. Teams of recruits were dropped into a wilderness area and given a series of objectives to complete while dealing with simulated enemy contact, equipment failures, and resource limitations. Sarah found herself assigned to a team led by Webb, along with Jennifer, David, and 2 other recruits named Thompson and Garcia. As they prepared for the exercise, she wondered if the old dynamics would resurface under pressure. The first day went smoothly. The team worked together effectively, with each member contributing their strengths to overcome obstacles. But on the second day, disaster struck. While crossing a river using a rope bridge they had constructed, Thompson lost his footing and fell into the fast-moving water below. Without hesitation, Sarah dove in after him. The water was shockingly cold and moved faster than it appeared from above. Thompson was already being swept downstream, unable to swim effectively in his heavy gear. Sarah managed to reach him and grabbed hold of his equipment vest, but the current was too strong for her to swim them both to shore. They were being carried rapidly toward a series of rocky rapids that could seriously injure or kill them both. "The tree branch!" Webb shouted from the shore, running alongside them. "Grab the branch!" Sarah saw it, a large tree that had fallen across the river about 50 yards ahead. If she could position them correctly, they might be able to grab hold of one of its branches as they swept past. Using all her remaining strength, she maneuvered herself and Thompson toward the right side of the river. At the last possible moment, she released her grip on him and pushed him toward the tree, sacrificing her own chance to grab hold. Thompson caught a branch and held on. Sarah was swept past, but the brief delay had allowed Webb and David to reach a point where the river bent and they could throw her a rope. She emerged from the water exhausted, bruised, but alive. That evening, as they sat around their campfire drying equipment and treating minor injuries, Thompson couldn't stop thanking Sarah for saving his life. "You know what?" Webb said, looking at Sarah across the fire. 2 months ago, I would have said you did that because you're some kind of hero. Now I think you did it because that's who you are. You see someone in trouble, you help. It's that simple." Sarah smiled, recognizing that Webb had finally understood the point she had been trying to make. "And if any of you had been closer to the river, you would have done the same thing." "Maybe," Jennifer said thoughtfully, "but probably not as well. You knew exactly what to do and how to do it." "Experience," Sarah said, "good and bad, but the willingness to try, that's something any of us can choose." Their team completed the exercise successfully, and when they returned to base, Sarah noticed that something fundamental had shifted in her relationships with the other recruits. She was no longer isolated by mockery or elevated by hero worship. She was simply part of the group, valued for her contributions, challenged when she made mistakes, and included in the everyday interactions that build real friendships. 6 months later, at their graduation ceremony, Colonel Harrison made a brief speech about the transformation he had witnessed in their class. He didn't mention Sarah by name, but he spoke about the importance of looking beyond surface impressions and recognizing the character that lies beneath. As Sarah stood in formation with her fellow graduates, she touched her scar briefly and smiled. It would always be there, a permanent reminder of one terrible and wonderful night in Houston. But it no longer defined her, either positively or negatively. It was simply part of her story, not the beginning, not the end, but one chapter in a life that was still being written. Webb, standing beside her in formation, noticed the gesture and whispered quietly, "Thank you for teaching us how to see." Sarah whispered back, "Thank you for learning to look." Their military careers were just beginning, but they had already learned one of the most important lessons any soldier can master: that true strength comes not from avoiding scars, but from how we choose to carry them, and how we treat others who bear their own marks of courage, sacrifice, and survival.